She's sitting back.
I'll do an informal introduction. Is
Sounds
that
good.
okay?
That sounds great.
So you don't need to, look up.
No, I don't. Just gonna read it off.
Are we on Zoom? We are. All right. Good afternoon. My name is Nira Zakovich. I work at Applied Ethics Center, and this is a talk that is part of our Future of Work series. And I am especially delighted to have our very own Jake Burley with us. Jake is a former student of the Department of Philosophy at UMass Boston and is now a graduate student at the Philosophy Department in Brandeis. And Jake will be talking about social and political risks of automation for about 45 minutes. And then J Hughes, who is the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and the senior fellow at the Applied Ethics Center, will respond, and then we will talk about it. Jake, welcome.
Good. Thank you, Nir, and thank you everyone who's here in person and on Zoom, and thank you Applied Ethics Center for putting these on. I hope you guys will bear with me. My voice is a little in and out, so we're recovering. So this talk comes as the result of some research that actually myself and Nir did over the course of the last 2 years or so. And the idea was to focus on some of the less obvious ramifications of automation, in particular AI-driven automation. So there's been a lot of conversation in recent years about the economic ramifications of AI-driven automation. People are concerned about job loss. People are concerned about what this will do to kind of a relationship with labor. People are concerned with how people are going to make a living. And those are all very, very interesting questions. But there has been less conversation around some of the more intangible consequences or potential consequences of automation. And so that is kind of the focus of what we're going to talk about today. So as AI-driven automation becomes more sophisticated and widespread, anxieties surrounding worker replacement by machines and algorithms are increasing. And indeed, occupations that were until recently considered more or less immune from the encroachment of automation are increasingly becoming targets for more sophisticated automation. Right? So automation has traditionally been thought of as this kind of manual labor replacement. But of course, as we are getting more and more complicated software-driven, algorithm-driven processes, the ability to replace more cognitively complex human labor and even more just physically complex labor is increasing. Okay? Some of you may be aware things, everything from legal support staff to radiology to loan assessment, travel and hospitality, wait staff, so a wide range of different jobs. One of the assertions that I want to surrounding future automation shouldn't just be understood as these economic anxieties. Insofar as work contributes to our sense of self-worth, the concerns about automation are personal as well as financial. They're related to these self-esteem, self-worth, dignity questions, in addition to the actual economic ramifications. Okay, so in order to understand the potential impact of automation on individuals' sense of self-worth, over the course of the talk today, we're going to be looking at automation through the lens of replacement and ask the question, what is it like to be replaced by a machine or an algorithm? The reason for focusing on that question is in part because it is in and of itself an interesting phenomenological question, this question of what is it like to be replaced. But we also might have reason to be concerned about this for more practical reasons. Right? So there are other areas of human experience where the experience of replacement leads to some very negative consequences. And in particular, one of the things that I've been looking at and that I've been looking at in conjunction with NIR is this, the effect of the sense of replacement in the political sphere, right? And here you have this nice ability to see very explicit claims of replacement made and to look at the consequences that you get. Okay? So, for example, and we can just talk about this, just to give you a roadmap of where we're going. So I'll give you an account of political replacement, why we might be concerned about that, right? Then I'm going to give you an account of automation and its impact on self-worth. And then we're going to try to kind of put the two together and see to what extent they're related, to what extent they might be different, and what we can learn from how they're similar and how they're different. Okay, so in the United States and abroad, white nationalists and white supremacists are making the explicit claim that foreigners are replacing them. One of the things that I did a great deal of research was this great replacement conspiracy theory that is being perpetrated across different circles, and that originated with a French writer. But this has kind of infiltrated both extremists in the United States, extremists abroad. You also see these same sorts of claims made in international extremist groups such as ISIS. And it's not just limited to extremist groups. You also see legitimate national actors making claims of replacement in order to motivate political action. This can be states such as China or Russia. This can be even domestically. We saw with the presidency of Donald Trump, one of the big claims was "Make America Great Again," right? This idea that somehow something has changed. Somehow there's been a loss of status, the replacement of some people by others, that we need to reverse course. Okay, so this is both present in extremist groups. It's present on national contexts, and it's a powerful motivating feature in politics, right? So it's worth mentioning that it's important to distinguish between normative claims we might want to make about replacement and the practical considerations surrounding it, right? So if you have an interest in ethics or moral philosophy, you might be interested in the question, when is it legitimate to claim that you've been replaced? Again, that's a really interesting question, and there's probably some really cool work that can be done to address that. But we're going to kind of sidestep that issue, at least today. And the reason being that what we want to understand is, regardless of whether or not a claim of replacement is legitimate or morally legitimate, practically legitimate, the sense of replacement, the experience of replacement, is the thing motivating political action, political unrest, even potentially political violence. And so it's that we need to kind of understand. So let's focus on what claims of replacement can tell us about the experiences of the individuals and groups who make those claims, and how claims of replacement serve as predictors of unrest and potential violence. Kind of the angle there. When you look at these claims of political replacement, you notice that trends start to arise. And I'm going to give you kind of 4 criteria that come out, or 4 themes that come out over the course of political replacement. And again, I just want to credit, this is something that I worked on with NIR, and I think is coming out in a feature paper of his. So that's where this kind of analysis is coming from. The key components are basically just that there's this loss of status to another group that's thought about unworthy. Another component is that you have this desire to regain status. Third component is that the lost status is promised, either implicitly or explicitly, or that you felt you implicitly deserved it. And fourth, the lost status has to be something that was valued and contributed to the perceived worth of the group in question, right? So these 4 things are supposed to give you components of a sense of replacement. When individuals, or in this case, groups of individuals experience a sense of political replacement. These are the four themes that tend to come out over and over again. One of the component that we'll really be focusing on here today is this last one, right? The loss of status being something that was valued and contributed to people's sense of self-worth. And just to kind of demystify that a little bit, I think it's very common for us to tie our sense of identity, tie our sense of self-worth to a group that we identify with. You see this in really silly examples like sports teams. You see it in more serious examples such as national context. So it seems like a pretty normal human behavior to identify with groups and in some way to partially tie one's sense of self-worth to the perceived value of that group. And if that's the case, then you would expect as the group status declines or is threatened, you would respond in such a way as though your own self-worth is being threatened. There's context here for things like social identity theory, which is sociologically often deployed. Again, I think there's details that are worth working out there. We're not going to spend too much time on them today. But that's the picture that we want to make. Okay, so now that we have this account of political replacement in front of us, and now that we understand the stakes involved when groups experience a sense of political replacement, let's talk a little bit more about the relationship between automation and replacement. So the goal of automation has always been to decrease human labor while increasing productivity. And in some sense, that is a very literal form of replacement. And we might ask the question, is that literal form of replacement tied meaningfully to this sense of political replacement? I'm going to argue, of course, it is. It's not just a semantic thing. There's an actual phenomenal similarity going on. And the key question is, how does replacement by automation impact our sense of self and sense of self-worth? And as we saw in the political sphere, we can make kind of predictive claims about how individuals might behave in experiencing a sense of replacement. So we'd love to get clear if there are things that we can predict about individuals' behaviors due to automation in an occupational or workplace context. One of the details that it's good to get clear right at the beginning when talking about this, many of you may have seen various statistics come out about how many jobs are going to be replaced in the future and how quickly. These reports tend to vary. But I will say that a good touchstone is there's a McKinsey report from 2017 that did a study on automation moving into the future. And they suggested that 30% of tasks within 60% of jobs have the potential to be automated in the next 2 to 3 decades, right? And so the key thing to take away there is that this fear about tomorrow there suddenly being this massive layoff of a particular occupation, that's very unlikely. It's very unlikely that that will happen even across several decades. There's some small subset of occupations that are susceptible to that sort of replacement, but those are few and far between. What tends to happen, or what is likely to happen, is that tasks within occupation will be replaced, right? This may lead to an overall decrease in employment in those occupations. It may not. We don't really know. It's difficult to predict that sort of thing, and part of that question is going to be along what timeline that happens. How quickly does it happen? So again, that's a question that we kind of set off to the side. This question of are we going to see mass unemployment? Because regardless of whether we see mass unemployment or not, all of our occupations are made up of these discrete tasks. And if it's the task that we value, or the ability to exercise certain capacities in performing those tasks that we value, then it's enough for the tasks themselves to be automated, whether or not the occupation goes by the wayside. And as I just noted, there are a significant number of jobs, at least according to many reports, that have a substantial automation potential within them. So this is a real concern. Another kind of foundational concept when talking about automation and replacement is this idea that our sense of self-worth and self-esteem is connected to our ideas surrounding work. Right? Sociological and psychological literature supports that intuition, which isn't hugely surprising. That literature has tended to be focused on the question of whether one has a job at all or does not have a job. And no surprise, there are a lot of negative psychological impacts associated with unemployment, and conversely, employment tends to lead other things being equal, to better mental health outcomes. The question of tasks is not as well addressed in the literature. That would be an interesting research question. But I'm going to posit to you all that insofar as tasks, it is the tasks that we're doing at our job that contribute to our sense of self-worth, contribute to our ability to exercise certain capacities. It's those tasks that are going to play a role in our sense of self-esteem or sense of self-worth. That's not to say that having a job or not having a job doesn't also play a role. It obviously does. It contributes to all sorts of ways in which we see ourselves as productive members of society, as providers. So these two things are intertwined, but we're going to talk about specifically the tasks issue here. So what kind of tasks are we interested in specifically? I'm going to suggest that the skills that people tend to exercise at their jobs are more than just like having the knack for getting a printer unjammed, right? We exercise much more human capacity in our workplaces. That can be as decision makers, as problem solvers, as individuals who have spent considerable time gaining knowledge and experience to perform well at tasks. I'll give you a quick personal example just to kind of make the point vivid. So for many years, I've worked in a hardware store, sold a lot of different things, in particular paint, right? And one of the things that I enjoyed doing while I worked there is I'd help people pick out colors for their houses, right? And I got pretty good at it over time. And I started to take pride in the fact that I got to be this person who had this role in the store of talking to people about their color decisions, right? This wasn't in and of itself a particularly important thing to me. I mean, I don't see myself as a color designer as some kind of like crucial identity component. But there's something about being able to exercise this creative judgment making capacity that I did value, and that did contribute to my sense of the role I was in, my contribution to this team I was a part of. It reinforced my sense of kind of self-worth in that, in exercising that capacity, right? And one of the things that I want to kind of draw out with that example, other than just being a tangent into my work history, is that these sorts of capacities, they're not just at these high level cognitive occupations, right? They pervade a whole array of different occupations. So I think it's easy, especially since many of us tend to interact with people in higher education, to think of these capacities specifically as these like kind of high level cognitive capacities that we often will exercise throughout our daily lives. But these things are present all over the place in all kinds of different occupations. Now, that's not to say that every single person at every single occupation is going to place a super high value on the specific task they do. I know I have had jobs that I just did for a paycheck. I imagine most people in this room have done some job that they did just for a paycheck. And so there's room in this analysis to say that there's going to be occupations, moments in people's lives where they perform tasks just as a functional component. There is this interesting question of whether or not that links up to this kind of broader picture of seeing yourself as maybe a provider, or seeing yourself as a productive member of society, or someone who can provide for themselves. So those are all interesting questions. But what I'm trying to draw out here is just this idea that these capacities, these important human capacities that contribute to our sense of self-worth, can be found all over the place. And it's also worth mentioning that there are lots of jobs that people do not enjoy doing, and that they do just because they have to. And automation can provide relief from that sort of thing. So the point of this analysis isn't to simply paint automation in a negative light. There are definite benefits to automation as well, obviously. But insofar as automation can take tasks that we value away from us, it can also negatively impact us. Okay. So just to kind of recap. So again, there may be real economic challenges related to worker displacement by AI-driven automation. But we also want to address this separate issue about how the tasks being replaced contribute to individuals. So we have this account of political replacement. We have this account of what I'm going to term occupational replacement, which is when an algorithm, machine, or some complex of those things replaces you in tasks at your job or at an occupation that you value, right? And I said at the beginning of the presentation here that we might have reason to be concerned about occupational replacement because of the negative consequences that a sense of political replacement can be seen to lead to. Okay, so we've seen our account of political replacement. We've seen what's at stake in occupational replacement. Now we'd like to see how they related, how are they different, right? And to the extent that both of these things impact elements of our lives which do contribute to our sense of self-worth, they certainly have some feature in common, right? So one similarity is that occupational replacement, like political replacement, involves a loss of status, right? And this is status kind of broadly construed, not just social status. It can be status that you hold of yourself. It can be value. It can be worth. Status is kind of a shortcut catch-all term. So, for instance, status one might have in a professional setting as being excellent at a given task, or the more general status one might be afforded as contributing to a success of a team or a business, right? That's in common between the two accounts. However, unlike political replacement, it's not entirely clear that the desire to regain status functions analogously between political and occupational replacement. So when a group experiences a sense of political replacement, there's generally another group they explicitly blame for that loss of status, and therefore a specific source of ire for the sense of replacement, right? The negative experience of losing political and social status becomes a motivator to regain that status, and specifically to take it back from whatever group holds it now. So in this way, political replacement tends to be antagonistic towards specific groups. It's not entirely clear what an analogous outlet in the case of AI-driven occupational replacement would be, right? It's not entirely clear that you can have the same sort of frustration at an algorithm as you're going to have at a person or at a group of people, or the perception of those people, right? it's not clear that the entity replacing the task or the worker can be held directly accountable for the replacement, right? There's no inferior employee who gets the job. There's not some rude outside hired into the position. The entity replacing the worker's judgments and talents is impersonal. We can kind of posit that maybe instead of replace workers, more likely to direct their frustration, whoever made the decision to implement the technology to replace them, or who the worker feels is otherwise responsible for the change. And it's interesting to see that that moves into a different kind of frustration, right? It's indirect. You're not frustrated at the actual piece of machinery. You're frustrated at the individual implementing the change, or the the individual who's making those sorts of decisions. And there is some empirical support for the fact that we tend to experience artificial replacement as less threatening to our sense of self-worth and replacement of human workers. But there's an interesting study in 2019 where participants were asked whether they preferred human workers to be replaced by robot. I'm sorry, whether they preferred human workers to be replaced by robots or by other human workers. And when considering the question generally, participants tended to respond in favor of human workers replacing other human workers. Right? So when you're asked just kind of the general theoretical, who would you rather have replacing someone? People tend to respond by saying we prefer humans to have those jobs. However, when asked specifically about their own jobs, participants tended to prefer that they'd be replaced by artificial workers rather than by human workers, right? That's not conclusive evidence by any means, but the study points to this possibility that we're less likely to feel personally threatened by machines replacing us than we might by other people replacing us, right? Who can actually have this personal connection. There are some other ways in which occupational replacement differs from political replacement. So AI-driven occupational replacement is notably piecemeal and incremental. And that's kind of something that we noted at the beginning of the talk, right? What's going to be automated is these discrete tasks, not entire occupations overnight, or at least for most occupations that will be true. Instead, professions are incrementally transformed as particular tasks and sets of tasks are automated and employees' time is redirected. On its face, that's a more subtle kind of replacement than the dramatic political replacement being claimed by extremist groups or even nation states, right? So the Chinese government has a political rhetoric surrounding the replacement of their position as the dominant political force on planet Earth, right? And those claims are not about this subtle kind of intricate replacement step by step of China's place in the world, right? That may be true. That may in fact be what happened, or it may not. But that's not the account that's being relied on to drive this sense of political replacement, right? The account that's being relied on is that there is a grand history that stands in contrast to the current moment, right? Same thing when you hear right-wing populist demand that America be made great again, right? It's not that you see this citation of a bunch of incremental changes to social and political structures and how people are interacting with them. It's that there's this massive paradigmatic shift, broad sweeping social problems, and a proud tradition under imminent threat, right? And that's what motivates, that's what drives this sense of placement. That's all very different than, I think, the occupational replacement story. And if you think that maybe these two things can kind of be linked up to each other, I think that's a reasonable thing to think. But as we're going to see, I think that comes out if you start to tie occupational replacement with political replacement. We'll kind of touch back on that in a moment. So the the most significant difference between these two types of replacement is that in the case of political replacement, it's a group of people linked by a shared identity who experience the sense of replacement. Whereas in the case of occupational replacement, it is, at least initially, an individual who's experiencing a replacement. In the case of political replacements, it's the social status of a group and its position in society that's at stake. On the other hand, in the case of occupational replacement, it's the skills and capabilities of the individual which were replaced. And it's the individual who's negatively impacted if those skills and capabilities were instrumental in contributing to their sense of self-worth, right? So broadly speaking, political replacement is this group phenomenon. It's something that happens to a social group or to something that someone perceives as a social group. Certainly, it's an experience at the individual level. I'm not trying to make complicated claims about collective experience in terms of social groups, but an essential component in how a sense of political replacement is engendered is the way in which it functions at this group level, right? Occupational replacement, on the other hand, seems to be about tasks that are replaced and the way in which those tasks contribute directly to an individual's sense of self-worth as a function of their ability to exercise certain important tasks, right? Now, I've just listed a lot of differences between the two accounts, and you might at that point kind of ask this reasonable question. Well, you've just cited a lot of differences between these accounts. What reason do we have to really think that these two accounts of replacement are linked at all? If they're different, that's interesting too. But the concern is always that we're just using the term replacement in both of these contexts. It might mean completely different things, and that's something that I want to just address here as we get towards the end of the presentation. So what I want to argue is that we should consider these types of replacement as connected exactly because one operates at the individual level while the other operates at the group level. And it's for this same reason that we should be concerned about the future of occupational placement. Individual occupational replacement has the potential to become group replacement when individuals begin to see themselves not simply as a collection of people who share something in common in their occupation, but rather as a group that is in some sense defined for what they share in common, or in this case, what they've lost. So a really clear example of this, I think, is what you see happening with the relationship between political parties in this country and so-called blue-collar workers in manufacturing and traditional energy sectors, right? It's fairly clear that a huge contributor to the occupational displacement those groups have experienced is automation practices, along with globalization. But automation has made it more efficient to produce more with less people, right? It's not just that those individuals have lost something in the sense they've lost a set of tasks or an opportunity to exercise certain capacities. It's that they've begun, or it's that they sort of see themselves as a political group, as a social group. It's not just that an individual miner has had a task taken away, it's that a group of miners have seen themselves as robbed of something that was implicitly promised to them. I think that it's pretty clear that how that's functioning in those sectors in American politics. And I think we have reason to be concerned that something equivalent could happen in the future in terms of occupational placement. So, for instance, it's one thing to say that you're going to replace a great number of, say, long-haul truckers with automated tractor trailers, right? And at some level, that may rob those individuals of the ability to exercise, say, a very complicated set of know-how, of knowledge, of experience. As someone who drove not those, but large trucks in the past, it's not an easy thing to do at all. But if you do that enough, it's not just that you're going to have individuals either laid off or individuals who have now shifted from a set of experiences and knowledge that they collected over years to some completely different set of experiences that they may not connect with, say, overseeing a fleet of these trucks, right? Maybe the picture is that we're going to retrain and reskill these people to do something more complicated. That may be the economically prudent thing to do. That might be the reasonable thing to accommodate people so as not to have them lose the opportunity of employment. But it may not address their desire to exercise particular capacities. If that set of people begins to see themselves not just as a bunch of individuals who have lost opportunities to exercise capacities, but rather as a group that is identified by something they share in common, then this occupational replacement, I would assert, can really quickly become this sense of political replacement, with all of the dangers that has, whether that just be benign political action, political unrest, or actual political violence. So it's not that we need to be directly concerned with occupational replacement. It's not that you're going to see outcomes from individualized replacement at the same level as you see at the group level of political replacement. It's that one has the potential to transform into another. All right, so I'll just close with more effects here. So that's the picture, that's the relationship that I want to paint for you all about the relationship between occupational and political replacement. So for the time being, AI-driven automation has taken over relatively discrete tasks, and perhaps as significantly, it has up until fairly recently been confined to automating the tasks of low-skill, low-wage workers. That trend is not likely to continue. As judgment-dependent or high-skilled tasks become automated, the potential for individuals currently doing those tasks to experience a sense of replacement appears high. As the number of people experiencing that sense of replacement grows, the potential for their individual experiences of replacement to coalesce into an experience of group replacement doesn't seem at all far-fetched. So while it looks like there are real differences between how the experience of replacement functions in an occupational setting compared to a political setting, the driver of the experience of replacement appears to be the same. Namely, that when something which contributes significantly to our sense of self-worth is perceived to be taken away from us, whether that be our social status or our group's political ascendancy, or the opportunity to exercise professional judgments or something else entirely, and that's handed off to someone or something else, we feel as though we are worth less than we felt we were. We feel less significant, we feel more disposable, less valuable. Not just that we get replaced, we are made to feel replaceable. So while AI-driven workplace automation is a piecemeal process, unlikely to cause sudden and widespread unemployment in any single sector in the immediate future, the potential for the pace of automation to displace individuals from occupations that contribute significantly to their sense of self-worth is concerning and should be taken seriously. With more diligent research and careful thought, I think that we can figure out solutions or ways to address this oncoming replacement. The potential negative impact of AI-driven automation on individuals' sense of self-worth, as well as the foreseeable social and political consequences which are likely to result, make studying this crucial as we prepare for the future. Thank you very much for the time, and turn it over to Jay.
Okay, thank you. So I thought Jake's paper was very fertile territory for investigating a question that's been much on my mind, and that is why has there been a rise of fascism? Why has there been a democratic recession for the last decade around the world? Why do we see in both liberal democracies and in even authoritarian states an increasing tightening of the fascist screws? And for me, as someone who has a materialist interpretive frame, I think you do have to look at things that are happening in the economy and in the material basis of society, such as automation, for that kind of set of connections. Obviously, replacement, the concept of great replacement is central to the global fascists, at least the white European American versions of this. The idea that our white Christian identities are being replaced, immigrants are coming in, et cetera, et cetera. But I wanted to do a little bit with your concept and expand it both temporally and sociologically. Talk about some of the different theories about why the fascism is on the rise and how they may be connected to this broader question of automation and industrial change. So there's theories about why the failure of communism, the failure of social democracy, and the failures of neoliberalism all gave a political space to a new kind of far-right ideology. There are people who talk about the driving forces of sexism and racism, but that kind of begs the question. Sexism, racism have always been with us. They seem to be declining in certain ways. Why would they be more mobilizable now? Demographic changes, migration. We've had demographic change. We've had migration in the past. What is it about it that's doing it now? Economic insecurity and precarity. We've certainly seen in the 1930s. We saw fascist, actual Nazi rallies in the United States. So economic insecurity and precarity, which is directly tied back to industrial change, is a part of this picture as well. So let me also say Acemoglu and Restrepo did back in 2017, they published a paper where they looked at the density of industrial robots in the country and the parts of the country that switched, that had significant populations that switched, especially non-college educated whites, switched from Obama voters to Trump voters. So why is and this is a general phenomenon in social democracies around the world, that the social democratic parties are collapsing and a lot of their blue collar base is going to the right. They found, Acemoglu and Restrepo, they found that there was this correlation. Men suffer twice as much job loss from automation as women. That helps contribute to the gendered nature of this kind of anxiety, this kind of precarity. And of course, workers without college degrees are at a much higher risk of this kind of displacement than workers without college degrees. So in terms of expanding the temporal scope of this, I mean, I don't know if you consider a tractor to be automation. I do. But to the extent that we automated agricultural labor and then contributed to this broad shift in society to industrial labor, and then from industrial labor to the service sector and the growth of the various kinds of service jobs, in general, we've seen over the last 200 years a shift from physical labor to mental labor. And one of the consequences of that, I'll talk about the consequence in terms of education in a second, but one of the consequences, I think, sociologically, is the destabilization of traditional sex and gender categories and systems. So you had the opportunity when you had different kinds of labor for women to enter into the workforce. You had a higher demand for higher education, which women excel at, or doing better than men at. You also had, but you had then changes intrinsic to the sex gender system as well. You had contraception and abortion access, and you had the decline of traditional sex gender attitudes. And for me, one of the other central themes is not just the economic precarity or the racial anxieties that are common, but almost everybody in the far right is obsessed with transgender, right?
with the gender politics, as Meloni, the new fascist prime minister of Italy, calls it. Gender politics is anything that critiques or deconstructs or erodes traditional sex and gender identities. And so the replacement, I think, is not just economic, occupational, and racial, it's also a sex gender replacement. Meloni, the speech we were talking about earlier, she gave a great speech where she said, look, the leftists want to take away your national identity, your racial identity, your religious identity, your identity as a mother, your identity as a woman. And I think there's some truth to this, that these changes, what we have offered since the Enlightenment of liberal individualism as a way of reconstructing the way that we understand the world is a genderless identity, right? And so it has a central threat to these kinds of identities. One of the consequences of this changing gender identity and the education of women is crashing fertility rates. That's become much a part of the concern of the far right. If we could only go back to when women were mothers and we're talking about 12 kids, everything would be better. And so for me, this is all in the context of perhaps the dotted lines are a little bit more attenuated to automation, but I think it's all in the context of automation. Also an attenuated dotted line, but in the context is ethnic change, migration, why people move from one place to another. The fact that very few states have multi-ethnic identities, but these changes now seem to be generating more anxiety than they did in recent decades. The higher education part of this, I think if you think about the differential precarity that blue-collar workers face because of automation in particular. So whether people are actually being replaced, the sense of precarity and the sense of growing income inequality is very tangible and very real. And that's something that, like David Auteur, he says, look, there's no evidence yet for people actually being replaced, but what is clear is that there's skilled biased inequality that is occurring. And that skill biased inequality is making people who do not have college educations feel like they're being screwed by those who do have college educations. That also then contributes to our political dilemma, which is that the older political model of trade unions backing a social democratic party as the basis of the resistance to capitalism, neoliberalism, that has become imperiled, as Piketty has pointed out, by the political incompatibility of college-educated people and non-college educated people in the same political formation, because they have fundamentally different interests and they have very different cultural orientations. So this cosmopolitanism and the reaction against cosmopolitanism is a part of this replacement story as well. There's the urban-rural divide, which for 200 years, as urbanization has been occurring, rural people have been feeling screwed by depopulation and by the increasing impoverishment of rural areas. And most of the United States and a lot of the world is rural areas still, and those people have disproportionate political influence in the United States. Urbanites have higher income. Every major city in the United States is democratic compared to the countryside, which is the rural. And then that contributes to this great replacement idea, as Sarah Palin said, it's the real Americans versus the non-real Americans. And the non-real Americans are everybody who lives in the cities, and the real Americans are the heartland Americans, who are the ones who are in the heartland. So back to the failure of communism and social democracy, I think I follow Piketty's argument that this is very clearly tied to the industrial change, the collapse of trade unions, and the rise of higher education, as I said. So just to say again, great paper. I think that the context for understanding what people mean when they say they are being replaced, that's what's really interesting. And in terms of the connection to automation, I flash back on Spielberg's AI movie. And I don't know if you remember it, but there's a scene in it that could be a Trump rally 10 years from now of people getting together and smashing the crap out of robots. And basically venting, having their 10 minutes of heat against the robots that have displaced them in the world. And, that is the kind of core of a Luddist. I have always been, for decades now, very anxious about Luddism becoming a more prominent political movement, because I think it's a dead end. But that kind of Luddism is reflective, I think, of this quite legitimate understanding that people have that the broader forces of industrial change are benefiting wealthy people at the top, also benefiting educated people disproportionately, which is what, by the way, educated people, college-educated people are less anxious about automation than blue-collar people. That it's driving the urbanization that's screwing them rurally. It's driving changes in the sex-gender system, which is making men lose their power and mothers lose their status. And so behind all of these changes, there are these industrial changes, and to not point to that, I think would be an idealist interpretation of history. That would be.
So let's open it up to questions. Yeah. What do you think? Chris.
Well, I've got a bunch. Just a suggestion, and this would be quite in contrast to Jay's suggestion that you go in a materialist direction. It seems to me that Pippa Norris and Ronald Engelhardt have put forward, the basic story about cultural backlash to a scheme of values that changed in the late 60s and early 70s to a liberal egalitarian scheme of values. And you have cultural backlash against that. So you have a changing status hierarchy that was basically a status hierarchy that was eviscerated, and there's a lot of resentment vis-a-vis that. Now they put that in the context of an account of populism. You don't need all that. I mean, it's a contemporary. I think the book is called Cultural Backlash, yada yada yada, populism and something or other. But basically, that story is very easy to plug into your worries about replacement theories. And I think it would help a bunch in the account of status that you've got, because in one sense you've got an account of an immediate loss of status, but it seems to me at the background is actually a changing status order that happened over about 45 or 50 years. That feelings of loss of status are quite key to. So that kind of stuff. I mean, also Arlie Hochschild's work on strangers in their own land is also very helpful here. It's the same kind of, it's a really nice phenomenological exploration and ethnological exploration of feelings of resentment and loss of status. And that I think preview, now we've got this discourse of replacement theory, but the replacement theory stuff just plugs right into the stuff that was written 4 years ago, written 6 years ago and published 4 years ago. So then I'm worried about the connection. I'm worried about the connection between what you were calling political replacement and occupational replacement. And one thing that worried me is that when you talk about groups being replaced, it was a little too anodyne. The groups we're talking about are ethnicized or racialized in the sense that they're hereditary identities. They're identities you can't shake, that individuals have them throughout their life, and they feel an existential threat of being replaced. And that seems to just psychologically work very different on the occupational thing. If I'm being replaced occupational, for sure, I've got to grieve some loss and so like that. But our ordinary story about that is retraining. You can change your occupation. Yes, you lost something, right? But being replaced by something else doesn't mean that's the end of your ability to gain status. Now, whether that's true or not, of course, there's a spectrum of how much you can get and how much you can get retrained at 58 years old, and so on and so forth, right? But nevertheless, there's a really deep phenomenological difference between the sense of being replaced ethnically or racially or hereditarily or some kind of a more or less permanent identity you're born into versus being replaced in your occupational activity. So that seems to me a very fundamental difference in the experiential / moral / phenomenological experience of those kinds of replacements, such that I almost think you've just got two words that are applying to phenomena at the same time. So I guess maybe I should just shut up there. I got another idea. But
let me because I'll lose.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really interesting point, and definitely there is something about the way in which we couch our I'm gonna say broadly politicized, ethnic identity, all these other things, which is different, I think, intuitively different from the way that we relate ourselves to our, say, occupational identities or even the tasks within those. But I think that the concern is not that you get the occupational replacement and it's just immediately a one-to-one with the politicalism. The issue is that the occupational replacement can drive a coalescing into groups. So for instance, you know, you could ask yourself, are manufacturing workers in the United States right now, are they really all part of the same political group in the sense of being part of the same ethnic identity or sharing some fundamental identity feature? You know, in one sense, maybe you could argue that they aren't. In another sense, I think that we would say, yeah, they do share something in common. They're all part of this kind of background of being in these manufacturing sectors, which involve certain other identity impacts, right? They tend to be more rural, they tend to have certain types of upbringing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the point's really well taken, and I think you're absolutely right that there is this very distinct character to this kind of political replacement versus this occupational. But I think the concern is that there's no reason to think that in 50 years and 70 years, you can link up otherwise seemingly disparate groups of people by this shared loss. So I think that's kind of the thinking behind it.
Okay, can I just add one comment, because I also think Chris's point is very interesting. There's a way in which, as I understand it at least, there's a way in which, hearkening to that meeting we had yesterday with rhetoric of mass violence people, there's a way in which the project is a sort of early warning indications project. I actually don't think that the language of replacement in politics is rationally coherent either.
No.
People don't have a claim on not being replaced. The replacement itself is questionable. It's just that it's psychologically easy for some reason under certain circumstances to make that kind of point. And part of, I think, what, if I understand it correctly, part of what Jake is exploring is, are there similar ways in which it's psychologically easy, even though there are conceptual and rational differences that almost make one replacement metaphorical in one complete way and the other in another complete way, just for that kind of language being used there, there's something so psychologically potent about it as a descriptive point, that the kind of early warning sirens are activated, as it were, if that makes sense.
It does. I didn't say that like the replacement is rational or anything like that. I'm just saying that the underlying driving psychology of feeling an existential threat that you're being replaced is quite different.
It is.
If you know your identity is in some loose and looser sense tied to your occupation. I mean, you know, that seems clear that our identities are more and more loosely tied to. You know, the gig economy is going to force us into getting out of that sort of 50s mindset that you have an occupational identity. What you have is an identity of somebody who floats through jobs. And that's not the identity of being, you know, a son of Columbus or, you know, what are they called, the Mayflower people?
Well, urbanization problematized identity just from the get-go, because as soon as you're in the city context, you are a part of different non-overlapping groups, and you can be a dog on the internet, that kind of thing. So I think it's precisely the kind of modern cosmopolitan modernity that is undermining all of our identities.
So one thing I just also wanted to mention, because so because I think there's this question, even if you're experiencing the occupational level, can kind of link up to the group in the same way that you can link up with others who maybe share more basic identity features. To use kind of a real life example, I remember working with a guy years ago who had actually experienced this kind of occupational replacement and technology. And he was an older gentleman, who, was not likely to kind of retrain, and go back on the farm of the new set school. And he was understandably, very upset about this, development. And he took it, what I found very interesting though, is that he took it so personally. It wasn't just that, it wasn't just rational, like, oh, well, these things happen. This is someone who was, an extrovert, really enjoyed working with his customers, and clearly saw his interactions with his customers as a really fundamental part of what made going to work worthwhile. So even though he was still employed, even though all these things were still happening, no one was preparing him. The loss of being able to do this clearly impacted him very strongly. And so I wonder, because clearly that the strength of the psychological motivation was there in a certain sense. I am curious, I'll have to think more about what you're saying about kind of like, can you motivate the same sort of feeling with the occupational system as with the political identity in this interest?
And in some sense, we already have cultural scripts, right? We've been playing with capitalism as creative destruction now for 150 years. Everyone knows, oh, it's just the money, right? So it's like, it's, you lose your job and you're like, oh, it's just the money. It's just the rich people or whatever your,
right. And that's
rather abstract sort of behind the curtain workings is. That's very different than feeling, not to justify again, this is just a feelings analysis and what happens with those feelings. What's the tendency, right? Because the early warning idea is that the same psychological mechanism is like on its way. And now if they can just connect in a sort of rhizomatic matter, we might have political unrest from folks being replaced by automation or something like that. And if the psychology is different, then that's the question.
Well, so this, kind of continues the conversation. So I wonder then too, sort of what the thinking for using the same language is as well, because I wonder, all the examples that we can think of political replacement are ones that we want to project because they are these obvious, like, racialized versions of replacement. And it seems like the automation fears of replacement are often very legitimate. And so I wonder too, if the idea is, well, there's this kind of similar motivation between the two of them. I wonder if trying to draw such a clear line between the two, I just worry, does that kind of create a scenario where now we say, oh, look, this is, the similar kind of logic, we accept it over here in terms of the automation conversation, but we want to reject it over here. I wonder like what putting the language to use in that way does. And I don't know. Maybe
Do you mean the worry is that it being a legitimate fear in the automation context means that we might want to grant it as a legitimate fear in the political context?
Well, no, well, at least I guess the concern is,
Either way.
well, yeah, why try and draw such a clear connection between these two if one feels completely legitimate and the other feels like we absolutely want to reject for all kinds of.
Oh, I don't actually think that I want to reject either, but I don't think the experience of a central replacement is a reason to reject anything. I mean, it is literally just a phenomenal, experiential, or psychological phenomenon. Now we could ask on top of the experiential question, are there kind of normative reasons why we would want to act on it? But those are two totally separate questions. We may take very seriously. I guess what to make the point even stronger, you might want to take someone's radical notion of being in place very seriously at the experiential level, because they really are experiencing that, and that might not be good. But you might want to totally reject it at the level of you now have normative reasons to go and do X, Y, or Z. So I think they're just two totally separate questions. Yeah, if I'm understanding.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and some part of the replacement story here in the United States that I don't think people pay enough attention to is a book that Roy Texera published, attached, a pollster attached to the Center for American Progress and Clinton's. He published, I think, back in 2008, called The Democratic Majority or the Progressive Majority. And he basically, and he and a lot of pollsters made the argument that because of demographic change in the United States, then eventually white people will be a minority. And at that point, we would have democratic utopia. And I don't think it's panning out that way, which is interesting. I mean, what the cross-ethnic appeals of this form of fascism is. But I think that was just like pouring fire, fuel on fire. To say, you're all going to be a minority soon, so your white Christian ways of life, well, we can forget about it. But yeah, I don't see very many people mention it.
There are no questions right now on the chat.
I wanted to ask about a totally different topic, which was the focus on tasks. And this is just like me spinning things, but like, I can imagine that a radiologist doesn't mind retraining a little bit so that they're not reading, 45 scans a day and putting it into the Medicare records. I can imagine that a lawyer doesn't really mind that all of a sudden they don't have to proofread that contract in exactly the way they had to. In other words, I can imagine a lot of the sort of modern symbol pusher work folks actually, welcoming a lot of replacement of the everyday tasks without a loss of identity for those tasks. So then there seems to be tasks that they wouldn't at all want to give up, right? The radiologist doesn't want to give up weekly tumor board with the other doctors to talk about things. The lawyer doesn't want to give up the client interview or the talking to another lawyer about like some little contingency that they hadn't yet considered that came up because of this particular client, or so on and so forth, right? So those kinds of human interaction things, the kinds of imaginative work, the kinds of new tasks, those kinds of things would be, I can imagine those being sort of identity threatening to have to give up. I mean, when you said restaurant servers were going to be automated, I was like, really? I mean, as a customer, I don't want to be waited on by a robot. I want to be in that Spielberg and be snatching, the robot host. But why the focus on tasks, I guess? Can you say some more about task versus occupation? Because I didn't quite get that. And I was thinking a lot of times I'd happily give up a bunch of tasks.
Yeah, and that's fine. So maybe
The college professor might like to give up grades.
so, and then maybe I won't try to touch on this in the talk, but maybe I could emphasize a little bit more, right? So the reason to focus on tasks is that even though the kind of popular description of automation has been that everyone's going to be out of the job, and by 2050 or something, that's just not what the picture looks like right now. It's not supported by evidence. Very, very hard to just automate a task. Automate an entire profession. It's not particularly efficient. So instead, you piecemeal incrementally start to automate tasks, discrete tasks within a profession. So that kind of led the analysis to this question of, okay, well then what's the relationship between tasks and self-work? And absolutely, there are going to be plenty of tasks that don't contribute in a meaningful way to your sense of self-work, right? You might be doing a job that overall you love and that overall contributes strongly to the sense of your work, but there may be specific tasks that you couldn't care less for, like reading very carefully, proofreading a legal contract, or name anything. There can also be entire occupations that you do but don't actually contribute to your self-work, but that you do for other reasons, right? So those are all perfectly separable. Now, there's one sense in which you could say, well, great, we're going to free up a bunch of time for people to do the things that exercise capacity that do contribute to their sense of self-work. So the lawyer's not going to have to read all those contracts, and guess what? That's going to free them up to meet with these clients on something that's really meaningful to them, that they take something out of. The problem is that increasingly as automation becomes more sophisticated and more, we'll use kind of the umbrella term of AI driven, just to be much more sophisticated. Those tasks are at risk as well. So one of the cases that I went into detail in the paper that I left out here is the case of the loan officers, right? The loan officers are more and more that decision-making procedure of who gets loans being taken away from individuals. Now you can imagine a loan officer, a particular loan officer might say, well, it's not really the thing I enjoy, so what's it to me? You can imagine another person who says, no, my experience of doing this for 30 years and having a really good sense of, oozing with risk and who's not a good risk, that's a really important thing. And now that I don't have that anymore, I've been negatively impacted. So the distinction between meaningful and non-meaningful tasks is perfectly fine. The concern is just that as automation becomes more sophisticated, it's not necessarily just going to be these kind of number crunching tasks that get taken away from people. It is these judgment making, problem solving, potentially even creative tasks that gets kind of taken off people's plates. So that's
I think in the labor literature, there's a lot of talk about, oh, no, it's not going to be substitution for labor. It's going to be complementary.
sure.
You're gonna extend people's labor. Like, okay, but if there's an unlimited amount of demand for the thing that they do, then you could imagine that, you used to make 10 widgets, now you make 100 widgets, and now widgets are that much cheaper and everybody wants a widget. But it's not usually like that. And so usually once you have labor extension or complementarity, you're also displacing the need for other people in that occupation. So it's not so simple-minded. And this also gets to the difference between the Frey and Osborne and the OECD, that the Frey and Osborne said, look at all these occupations, the principal tasks are going to be automated, and therefore these occupations will disappear. And then OECD came back and said, no, look at the skill composition of these occupations. When you get rid of the part that can be automated, then they're just going to expand and do more of that other thing. But it's like, okay, but now instead of going to your doctor for expert diagnostic knowledge, you go for history taking and patient education, because that's the only part that the computer can't do yet. And do you really need a doctor for that? And so, the idea that the changing skill composition is waves away, technological unemployment, I think is wrong. But at any rate, yeah, I think it's a fascinating part of it. Really.
Yeah, it's going to be very difficult to predict what particular task or particular occupation will fall prey to which
Right.
Paradigm. It's yeah.
I understand that one of the things of the when it comes to nutrition, so it's a set of a job itself is a set of tasks. So that it's kind of supportive the point that you're making, but also I'm wondering, could there be any other kind of alternative explanation for the replacement when it comes to the different tasks? As to say, like, I think when there is a replacement in one task, the workers might be finding some other meaning in somewhere else in a new task that is introduced with the replacement, with the automation. Maybe like not even a task itself, could be a new way of social relation that is introduced due to the automation sometimes. So how would that like could there be any alternative explanations like that in like the replacement? And also I was wondering, like it is first of all it's a very interesting presentation for me. So I was wondering when it comes to the other aspect of the like as you mentioned, about the trade unions and the racial and gender aspect of it. Could there be like when you're telling it as the political replacement, would you be considering the power dynamics or the power relations that are being like distinguished between these automation and also like being reproduced within these automation? For example, like I think the mobility of these workers sometimes as we go when it comes to the political discussion and to find that. So how does that like worker mobility happen? Or maybe like how do they like when it comes to the labor union? So in that sense, I guess I'm not sure if that's the question right.
So let's do the second one first. So could you just like give me an example of what you mean by what you said?
So for the second question, I guess it was about like the result in our consequences, like in estimate. When the things happen, I guess like how does that impact the other aspects of like how they when it comes to the group identity itself, how do they like collectively organize or in that aspect?
On the like if someone's occupational place, like how would they transition to identify?
I guess my question is about the power relations that is introduced in this how they collectively organize or and how their social relations in that aspect are like impact.
Impact the organization,
Yes, really the organization.
the automation. I'm not sure, I guess I'll have to think a little bit more about that. And at some level, that sounds like something you'd want to maybe empirically look into, how people actually organize. In terms of like the theoretical question,
I think I'm not thinking to only the other collective activism or not anything like that in particular. I'm just curious about what other power relations that are introduced within political research and all that is being concerned in this context of activism.
If I can respond, I think there's also a lot of attention in the literature to the idea that the more power you have in the occupational sphere, the more you can ensure that automation comes in as a complement to your labor as opposed to a substitute for your labor. So if you're a secretary, you know, WordPerfect and travel.com or whatever can be a replacement for your labor. But if you're a doctor, you're not going to say, oh, well, diagnostic software replaces my labor. So you're going to say, if you're going to use, no one should be able to use diagnostic software except a doctor. You know, it all has to go through the doctor. So I do think that the power relations do get reproduced in that way. Yeah, sure.
Well, assembly also some automation is driven by a depowering motive rather than a profit motive or an efficiency motive.
Right.
Classic way of, you know, you de-skill the job and people don't have as much work.
Just to go back to the Engelhardt comment, you know, were you implying that you think, because part of their framework is that Protestant European countries and their liberal individualism is in conflict, kind of a clash of civilizations at a global level, which is global level. But is that part of the model that you think? Because I'm very sympathetic with the idea that liberal individualism is an affront to lots of people around the world.
I am sympathetic to that. But I'm more of a Hegelian than I'm
Hey, you need to stand on your head.
you had a first question.
The task like how could there be another alternative based off that to give meaning to themselves and working with thinking themselves? Could there be any reproduction of another task or maybe another relation which they're like which is the kind of the source of the
Totally. Yeah, so I think definitely, yeah. So you can have a task in place that would mean and you could go on to within the same occupation, different occupation, redirect your efforts, right, and create a new whether that be if I'm hearing that in kind of a social dimension of an occupation or just in exploring some kind of new task. I think one of the concerns would be that you would assume that within any particular occupation, there's some kind of boundedness to the types of tasks that you work for, right? So if you're, say, working as an administrative assistant and some tasks that you find meaningful and taken away from you, you might find it really meaningful to spend your time doing something that you really enjoy, but that might not be within the parameters of the actual occupation that you're in, or the skilling issue could arise. So I think in theory, yes, you can absolutely at the loss of one meaningful task replace it with one meaningful task, but that's going to be a question of what kind of parameters of occupation you're in. If you're in an occupation that has a very kind of limited set of potential tasks that could be included in it, that might be a difficult kind of transition. You can imagine over a longer time scale, occupations shifting to accommodate those sorts of things, but especially in the immediate, that can be. Does that answer the question?
First of all, I apologize, I missed the entire presentation and half discussion. So this may have been thoroughly discussed already and then just said, just simply death with that. But it strikes me that there's two kinds of replacements that would, and different two kinds than Chris talked about. I was an accountant and that job is replaced, and so I'm replaced as that, either cheaper accountant or automation, that's done, I've lost the accountant. But there might be where something I have becomes relatively demoted and marginalized, but it's still there. So for instance, let's say hypothetically, I don't know if this is ever the case, that classical music was the dominant cultural music, and I was a classical music lover. And that gets replaced as the dominant cultural thing by some kind of pop music. But I can still, there's still, I'm allowed to listen to classical music. There's still, although much less popular, there's more than enough venues for me to go to hear classical music. So I've lost its place of honor in society. What I'm interested in is what very few people are interested in. So in some sense, classical music has been replaced, and insofar as I identify deeply as a classical music lover, I've been replaced in that role. And yet the replacement has lost me nothing in some sense, in some material sense. It lost me some status stuff. So I'm just wondering how this might apply to an ethnic replacement. If I'm not going to be particularly repressed in my ethnic identity, and I can still go to the synagogue, and I can still eat the foods I wanted to eat and celebrate the holidays I wanted to eat. It's just that, Jewish identity no longer is the dominant identity in the United States, but I'm still allowed. It seems to me that's a different kind of loss. And I'm just wondering, do you see a difference in the psychology involved with the reaction based on that distinction?
Yeah, so first I'll just say that I think the second type of distinction, replacement you're pointing to, is the common sort that we see in kind of what I've been calling political replacement, or replacement of political groups or ethnic groups or political or social identity broadly construed, right? It is rarer to have a case where you are actually prevented from participating in the things that you found meaningful identity with. Right? What's more common is that the status of the groups that you identify with somehow diminish over the course of time or something along those lines. So I think that is the common circumstance, and I think that people take that very poorly, right? Because what they identified for some part was with the status of the group, not just the ability to participate in activities. Do I see that as wholly distinct or psychologically distinct from kind of whole cloth these things? I think that it is different. I mean, the way that you can make it analogous is if it's not just being an accountant, it's somehow participating in accounting groups, right, that you thought was really something to your sense of self-worth. Part of no longer being an accountant, somehow you're kicked out of all of these groups. And that would be analogous to, you're not just that classical music has lost its status, but you can no longer go and listen to it, something like that. So perhaps the relationship can be made there. But I think that the part of the idea of what is in the paper is that this individuated experience of replacement, in fact, losing your accounting position, is distinct from this kind of group status. I just think through that step by step a little bit.
I just want to say, I think the difference between being a perfectly multicultural society and having concentration camps and genocide is more analog than you're implying. I think when people lose hegemony, cultural hegemony, they do experience that as a sense of loss. If you start getting canceled for making a joke that when you were culturally hegemonic, you would not have gotten canceled for it, but now you're getting canceled. You can still make the joke. There's still people who would appreciate your joke, but the larger society is going to penalize you, So I think it's a lot more analog than binary.
We have time for one more question.
This is more me. I was thinking from the beginning very seriously your claim that this is kind of a phenomenology of replacement, and I was just thinking of these kind of emotions that are involved, and I just wanted to analogy between the kind of physical placement. In the kind of physical realm, right, the kind of emotions that seem to, kind of social emotions seem to accompany the placement often only comes in their work on humiliation, I mean, it's definitely a sense of humiliation, right? It's very, very clear, and because of clearly a social other, right? So you've lost faith towards another. And when I was thinking of occupational placement, on its own, especially when it's kind of AI-driven occupational placement, it's hard for me to see it, the dominant emotion on it, like, there may be the kind of humiliation, but that's more often when you have to tell other people what you're doing, right? Or when, everyone in the office is talking and you just like, you've lost. Whereas, but on its own, like, it seems to me that the emotion that kind of goes with it, I mean, apart from the frustration and the loss and that sense, like, it's very much a more on the level of a sense of embarrassment that what you were doing is just being taken over by this machine and the sense of de-skilling that you're passing skilling. So I'm just wondering whether you thought there was this kind of phenomenological difference between a kind of humiliation and a sense of embarrassment between doing this that.
So where I think that they're connected is that in both cases is close ties between a sense of self-worth as a result in the case of occupations of exercising certain capacities, in the case of political social groups of seeing your status as tied to the status of that group. So and your self-worth is tied to the status of that group. So in the sense that they're both concerned with the experience of self-worth and how external factors influence that self-worth, I think they're phenomenologically very connected. But I do think that they are distinct, and that's why I think that what we shouldn't say is that occupational placement is just some other version of political. Because one of the things that I hope to explore more later, I didn't really get a chance to get deep into it in the paper, is just this idea that it seems very unlikely, I think your intuition is right, it seems really unlikely that if you're replaced by some piece of software, you're gonna like have a connection about it and like break the machine office space style, right? You might feel certain ways. What's more likely is that you're going to get frustrated with the individuals that you think are accountable in some way for that. And I think that it's at that level that othering phenomenon starts to be place. And I think it's interesting that we have, it appears that the intuition is we have trouble doing that with artificial entities, right? Whereas we will create other people to be our enemies, even in situations where that's wholly irrational, right? And I think that is my concern about this, or one of my concerns about the transition from occupational to political placement, is that once you make that jump, it's hard to see how you haven't gotten away from the occupational aspect of this. My ability to exercise the capacity to take away that's negatively impacting my self-worth, and suddenly you instantiated some other to blame for this problem. And it seems to me that that is a tipping point into this political sensitivity. So, yeah,
I think it's also importantly related to Chris's point earlier, where the more work recedes from the center of identity, you would be embarrassed rather than humiliated. But you can imagine some cases where work is still at the center of identity, where I would assume you'd be humiliated rather than embarrassed. So, for example, if your identity is that you're a Go player, and that is central to your self-understanding, and you found out that machines have become a lot better than humans at Go, that's not just embarrassing. So the existential stakes, as it were, are higher. But I think that Chris is right that the set of cases in which that's true is diminishing. So I think we ran out of time. Jake, thank you very much. Jay, thank you very much. And the next talk is about robot rights, and that is, I believe, on October 21, and will be, given our predictions of rising COVID cases, will probably be fully online. And maybe robots will give it. But we'll see.
Well, we won't be using this in the future.
Yeah.
This did not work out very well.